No one noticed when I started disappearing. That's the part that hurts the most. There was no argument. No dramatic goodbye. No moment where someone looked at me and said, "You're not yourself anymore." I kept showing up. I kept responding. I kept functioning. So from the outside, nothing seemed wrong. Inside, I was already gone. I didn't wake up one day and decide to abandon my life. I didn't feel rebellious or broken. I felt tired. Not physically. Existentially. Tired of holding myself together in ways that didn't feel connected to who I was anymore. At first, it was subtle. I stopped caring about things that used to matter to me. Not because I outgrew them, but because caring felt heavy. Every emotion required effort, and I had learned to survive by conserving energy. I told myself this was adulthood. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself everyone eventually feels this way. That's how disappearance begins. Not with loss, with justification. I remember the exact moment I realized something was wrong. I was in a room full of people who knew me well. I was laughing at the right moments, nodding in the right places, answering questions with practiced ease. And suddenly I thought, if I walked out right now and never came back, how long would it take before anyone noticed something was missing? The answer came instantly. Not long. But not immediately either. And that scared me. I started paying attention after that. Not to my life, to myself. Or rather, to how little of myself was actually present. I noticed how often I said yes when I meant, I don't care. How often I said, I'm fine, when I felt nothing at all. How rarely I expressed a real opinion without softening it first. I had become agreeable in a way that erased me. The strange thing was, people seemed to like me more for it. I was easier to be around. Less complicated. Less demanding. Less real. I didn't disappear despite that. I disappeared because of it. I had learned that the safest way to exist was quietly. Without friction. Without taking up emotional space. I adapted so well that I slowly removed myself from my own center. Days blended together. Weeks passed without memory. I could look back on entire months and remember almost nothing specific, just the sense that I had been busy. Busy doing what? Maintaining a life I wasn't inside anymore. I stopped asking myself questions that didn't have easy answers. What do I want? Who am I becoming? What am I avoiding? Those questions were inconvenient. They threatened stability. So I replaced them with manageable ones. What needs to be done? What's expected of me? What keeps everything running? I became excellent at maintenance. Terrible at living. The scariest part was how normal it felt. There was no crisis. No breakdown. No external reason to stop. I was functional enough to continue indefinitely. That's when I understood something terrifying: you don't need to ruin your life to lose it. You just need to stop participating. I watched my own reactions like a stranger. When something good happened, I acknowledged it intellectually but felt no real joy. When something bad happened, I handled it efficiently but without emotion. It was as if my life was happening at a distance, close enough to manage, too far away to feel. One night, lying in bed, I realized I hadn't felt truly present in years. Not fully sad. Not fully happy. Just suspended in a permanent middle state where nothing asked too much of me, including myself. That was the moment the truth finally surfaced, quiet and merciless: I hadn't been living. I had been disappearing slowly, carefully, politely, so no one would feel uncomfortable. And the worst part? It was working. After I realized I was disappearing, I expected panic to follow. It didn't. What followed was something worse: familiarity. I recognized that version of myself. The quieter one. The easier one. The one who didn't interrupt, didn't demand, didn't complicate anything. I had been slowly becoming that person for so long that stopping felt unnatural. Disappearing had become a skill. I was good at it. I could sit in a conversation and contribute just enough to be present without being exposed. I could listen attentively while giving away nothing. I could agree without committing, care without investing, exist without leaving a trace. People trusted me. Because I never asked them to see me. That's when I understood the first uncomfortable truth: I wasn't disappearing against my will. I was cooperating. Every time I swallowed an opinion to keep peace. Every time I minimized a desire because it felt inconvenient. Every time I chose silence instead of honesty because honesty might shift something. Each choice felt small. Together, they erased my outline. I began to notice how much of my life was built around avoiding discomfort, not dramatic discomfort, but the subtle kind. The awkward pause after saying what you really think. The tension that follows when you set a boundary. The vulnerability of wanting something out loud. I avoided those moments like hazards. I called it being considerate. It was fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of discovering that if I showed up fully, I might not be accepted the same way. So I made myself easy to accept. And impossible to know. The internal breakdown didn't come as chaos. It came as a deep, exhausting sadness that had no clear cause. I couldn't explain it, which made it easier to dismiss. Nothing is wrong, I told myself. You're just tired. Everyone feels this way sometimes. But it wasn't sometimes. It was constant. I felt like I was living one step behind my own life, always responding, never initiating. Even my thoughts felt delayed, like echoes instead of intentions. I tried to remember when I had last felt fully here. The answer was disturbing. I couldn't. I realized how rarely I made choices based on desire. Most of my decisions were reactions, to expectations, to routines, to what would cause the least friction. I had trained myself to read rooms so well that I forgot how to read myself. That training had once kept me safe. Now it kept me invisible. The moral dilemma arrived quietly but firmly. Do you keep disappearing because it works, because it keeps relationships smooth, days predictable, life intact? Or do you risk reappearing, knowing that presence comes with friction, rejection, and the possibility that people prefer the version of you that doesn't ask for space? Staying hidden felt considerate. Reappearing felt selfish. That framing trapped me for a long time. I told myself that disappearing was a sacrifice, that I was choosing harmony over ego. That wanting to be seen was immature. That adulthood meant learning how not to need attention. But one night, lying awake, a thought cut through that narrative: if this is sacrifice, who is it for? No one had asked me to disappear. I had volunteered. And the cost wasn't noble. It was personal. I began to grieve then, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Grief for the energy I had spent shrinking. For the version of myself that used to argue, to dream, to take up space without apology. I missed that person. And I was angry that I had abandoned them so quietly. I also realized something terrifying: if I continued this way, no one would ever ask me to come back. Because nothing was obviously missing. My disappearance was polite. Efficient. Socially acceptable. That's when the fear changed shape. It stopped being fear of conflict. It became fear of erasure. I imagined myself years later, still functioning, still reliable, still agreeable, and completely absent from my own memories. A life filled with events I attended but never inhabited. That image terrified me more than rejection ever could. Because rejection at least confirms you were there. I understood then that disappearing doesn't protect you from pain. It protects everyone else from having to deal with your truth. And that protection comes at a price. I wasn't sure yet how to reappear. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know who I was without all the adaptations. All I knew was this: if I didn't interrupt my own disappearance soon, there would be nothing left to return to. And once that thought took root, disappearing stopped feeling safe. It started feeling like a slow, quiet kind of death. The moment I stopped disappearing wasn't dramatic. No confrontation. No declaration. No one applauded my return. In fact, no one noticed at all. That was the first painful lesson of reappearing: when you vanish slowly, coming back is a private event. I didn't suddenly become loud or bold. I didn't reclaim my space with confidence. I simply did one thing I had avoided for years. I answered honestly. The first time it happened, it felt wrong. Someone asked me a harmless question, what I wanted, what I preferred, what I thought, and instead of offering the easiest, smoothest reply, I paused. The pause was uncomfortable. Silence always is when people are used to your compliance. Then I said what was true. My voice didn't shake, but my body reacted as if I had stepped into danger. Tight chest. Warm face. The familiar instinct to retreat and apologize for existing too clearly. I didn't. Nothing terrible happened. No one left. No one attacked. No one rejected me outright. But something subtle changed. The air felt different. And so did I. That small moment showed me how deeply I had been trained to associate presence with threat. How much of my disappearance had been about avoiding that exact discomfort, the vulnerability of being visible without knowing how it would land. Reappearing wasn't empowering. It was exhausting. Every honest response required effort. Every boundary felt like friction. Every moment of presence demanded energy I hadn't used in years. Some days, I wanted to disappear again. It would have been so easy. The old habits were still there, ready to welcome me back. Silence. Agreement. Polite invisibility. They promised peace. But now I knew the cost. And I couldn't unknow it. As I continued, the consequences appeared, not all at once, but steadily. Some people didn't respond well to the change. They weren't cruel. Just confused. The version of me they knew had been simpler. Easier to predict. Easier to place. My presence disrupted that. A few relationships thinned. Conversations became shorter. Invitations changed shape. I saw clearly which connections had been built on my disappearance. Letting those go hurt more than I expected. Because it confirmed something I had always feared, parts of my life had only worked because I wasn't fully there. But staying would have meant continuing to erase myself for their comfort. I chose to stay visible. Not loudly. Not perfectly. Just honestly. I began to feel things again, not always pleasant things. Regret surfaced sharply once I was present enough to feel time. I noticed how much of my life had passed while I was managing, adapting, shrinking. There were moments of deep sadness when I realized that some versions of myself were gone for good. Not postponed, gone. Opportunities that belonged to a younger, braver person I hadn't allowed myself to be. That grief was real. I didn't try to turn it into motivation or inspiration. I let it exist. Because grief is the price of awareness. And awareness, even painful, is better than erasure. Reappearing didn't give me a new life. It gave me access to the one I already had. Time started to feel heavier, but also fuller. Days left impressions again. I could remember conversations. Feel tired for real reasons. Rest without escaping myself. I wasn't happier in a dramatic way. I was here. And that changed everything. I learned that presence isn't confidence. It's willingness. Willingness to be misunderstood. To be inconvenient. To take up space without guarantees. Disappearing had been my way of avoiding responsibility, not just responsibility to others, but responsibility to myself. Because being present means owning your reactions, your desires, your limits. It means accepting that your life will have texture, friction, mistakes, unfinished edges. But it also means your life will be yours. If you're listening to this and you recognize the quiet fading, the politeness, the shrinking, the exhaustion of being easy, I want you to understand something clearly. You don't disappear because you're weak. You disappear because it once kept you safe. But safety that requires your absence eventually becomes loss. No one came to pull me back. No moment forced my return. I stopped disappearing the moment I decided that being erased quietly was worse than being seen imperfectly. I didn't come back as someone new. I came back as someone unfinished. And for the first time in years, that felt like proof that I was alive. Not impressive. Not complete. But present. And presence, I learned too late and just in time, is what turned survival back into living.